Within the studio, our decision to sort of explore shadows, myths and follies came from our initial investigation of the city, and in particular this sort of idea that sort of significant components of the highs and lows of the city fell into these three categories.
The studio looks at the debate of the role of the high-rise in the urban realm that has recently re-emerged in Bristol. And towards that, it puts forward the question of what an architectural landmark in the city might be, drawing from this idea of the high-rise. Myths, follies and shadows are then proposed through the studio brief as typologies of such architectural markers. Follies talk about architectural elements that have lost their function and their meaning in the current context. Myths refer to narratives that emerge from the collective consciousness of the city, and then shadows talk about gaps and voids that emerge in the urban fabric.
Our project at Brief was at the Redcliffe Caves, which are an underground network linking quite a few disparate buildings through the city.
Well, I think in relation to Redcliffe Caves, there's a sort of a rich kind of narrative history around the myths that surround that location, sort of things to do with piracy, smuggling. They're sort of very, very much entwined in part of Bristol's sort of perceived history, whether or not those things are explicitly true. I think that is the nature of the myth a lot of the time.
We began looking at the Leadshot Tower in Bristol, which is a folly because it used to be used to produce lead shot and now it is used as a boardroom.
We decided to look at shadows because of our Lisbon project, which is something we were interested within that city. And we took it further when we were looking at the High Cross and how, as the dislocation of the High Cross continued, the absence that was left in its place became the shadow, or how the situation around the High Cross actually became the shadow itself.
The use of film within the studio went beyond just capturing the city as reference material, but actually as a way of exploring the design process and what film as a media offered in counterpart to a drawing, where the drawing would offer the panoptic. The film would offer a way of sort of examining the city in focus as a series of layers.
So we were asked to produce a film about our specific site. So we were given Redcliffe Caves. Obviously you can't access the caves, so that made it a little bit difficult. We wanted to explore with our film what it might feel like to be in those caves. So we looked at burrowing and this idea of burrowing and the sort of mythical creature which tied into St John the Baptist Hermitage and the Quaker burial ground that are on the site. And we wanted to look at this creature sort of emerging from the ground and into this world where it didn't quite understand what was happening because of all the bright lights and the complete disconnect from what was underground, which was all completely isolated compared to the ground above, which was this essential freedom.
When we came to produce our film, the idea of folly was quite centered to that. We saw the Leadshot as a permanent fixture in the urban environment of Bristol, and how the tower is being fixed to that point for several years, but at the same time all the landscape around it changes. So we had the idea of looking through the eyes of the building as a panopticon.
The film really enabled me to consider the site as a multitude of different layers of information that, when overlaid, create kind of new, unexpected outcomes. Due to the fact I'm exploring the nature of the uncanny within architecture, the filmic techniques of being able to overlay, play with transparencies, really enabled me to exemplify Freud's theory of the uncanny, which is something that should have remained hidden, kind of coming to light. So my film, through the use of juxtaposition and framings, enabled me to create kind of new readings and new interpretations of the site, which I think potentially a drawing or a photograph wouldn't convey.
The process of the film was quite difficult to begin with. Dealing with the dislocation of Bristol High Cross, we had to travel to several different sites. To make this easier, we made a time frame and a storyboard that allocated each site with a certain point in the film and a certain icon which helped direct the quality of the film and the characterisation of each that we were going for. In terms of thinking about the site, it revealed a certain absence around historical characterisations and importances, such as the Bristol High Cross or Mary Laporte Church. Both have kind of been forgotten and built around, and people aren't aware of their value anymore. I think it's important to bring that back.
Following the film, the students were asked to develop these architectural artifacts as objects that stood between the film and the drawing, or also between the drawing and the model. These were three-dimensional objects that began to look at the sites and model the sites the students were interested in by developing spatial concepts and certain tectonic language in themselves.
So for our artifact, which was looking at Redcliffe Caves, which was our site, we wanted our artifact to be like core samples. So core samples take samples from the earth and show you the geology or what's below in layers. And in the same way, we wanted our artifact to show the layers within each different part of our site, which we had subdivided.
The artifact, we took different layers which we wanted to represent almost as metric units, which we measured in certain points of the site. So, how much myth was attributed to a certain point of the site, or how much gathering or abandonment happened in certain parts of the site, because there's a lot going on.
In my artifact, I really wanted to explore and enforce the characteristics of the uncanny and create a 3D object of the site that went far beyond that of the traditional site model. So relating it back to the uncanny, the idea of the familiar converting itself to the unfamiliar, I decided to take the idea of the site map being the familiar thing. So by manipulating, folding, altering the site map and highlighting kind of characteristics of the uncanny within the site, such as use of shadow, uncertain depths, human traces, and the use of mirroring, this 3D artifact really became a manifestation of the uncanny within the site.
As the artifact was a stacking of layers of different times within Castle Park, I started to extrude these values upwards and start to overlap and find out where the absences and the voids created a new kind of form, and how this could create new links between various different parts of the site.
The outputs for the studio in terms of film and drawing and a move towards architecture, we felt was important that they shifted from the conceptual thinking, which embodied sort of an exploration of the shadows, myths and follies within the site, into built form. And we felt it was very important that we didn't have a dislocation at this point, that the conceptual component converted itself into the detail and the fabric of the building.
So having learnt about the rich history of the site and engaged with the different layers of the site through the film and through the artifact, I wanted my building's function to be representative of this. So I went for a multi-generational, multifunctional building that combined a nursery with an old people's home, with a theatre and with a gallery underneath the caves. I wanted to use the old buildings on the site because and sit within them a new building, so that you have that representation of the temporality of the site and the way that it has aged. So in the same way that you can see the visible aging of the site, you can see the visible aging of the people who are using the site as well.
So from my survey drawing, which highlighted connections between places where people could spend the Bristol pound, I decided to transpose that network into an architectural form for my roof canopy, and this form hopes to create a connection between St Nicholas Market and my own site, and the roof canopy hopes to cut through my own building to highlight this connection.
The function of my project is really to bring back the idea of mystery, drama, the theatre, the concept of the unknown back to the cinema. So a rejection of the familiar kind of archetypal cinema that we recognise now, which is somewhat quite passive experience, quite mundane, quite kind of outdated, and that represents the familiar that we know, and creating an unfamiliar experience, which is unexpected, exhilarating, immersive. And I'll do this by combining the cinema with a tailored dining experience, which immediately throws the users into this new dimension of film. And architecturally speaking, my building incorporates a lot of shadow play, different permeabilities, different transparencies, and all of that creates these layers that we can identify as being known elements, and the layering of them creates the unknown. So it's kind of an uncanny cinema.
So I took the new extrusions from the survey and overlaid this within my site of the Norwich Union building and tried to figure out how I could break up this shell of a concrete existing building, and this took the form of timber insertions that became parasitic and flowed their way through the existing shell and opened up new areas of the site. So I wanted to view these timber insertions as a piece of functional furniture that flows its way through the building, and it becomes these carved timber pods, and each piece becomes a functional piece of furniture within the different areas of the idea of the public house.
The outputs from the studio were interesting in terms of the influence of film, and particularly within that, the way that the film focused the students on existing structures rather than the panoptic of the overall city. This in turn led to the students repurposing and reusing existing structures rather than designing new high-rise landmarks within the city.
The close surveys that the film and the artifact asked for led to projects that acquired highly contextual approaches. The projects then engaged with the collective consciousness of the city in diverse ways that had to do not only with the tectonic responses, but also with the programs that these introduced into the urban contexts.